different parts of the Trump administration think different things, and it's not quite clear if the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. And this is a quite big problem. If a great power, if a superpower is saying apparently contradictory things to another superpower, then that can lead to the kind of misunderstandings that lead to big strategic mistakes.
Neil, can I start here? Does the Trump administration know what it thinks about China, how it feels about China?
Yes, but different parts of the Trump administration think different things, and it's not quite clear if the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. And this is a quite big problem. If a great power, if a superpower is saying apparently contradictory things to another superpower, then that can lead to the kind of misunderstandings that lead to big strategic mistakes. So my point in this piece is, if the administration is doing all kinds of tough things to China, tariffs, technology restrictions, export restrictions, investment restrictions, but the president himself is making nice in what he says about China, then what are they thinking in Beijing? What do they make of this?
At the risk of simplifying what is an intelligent article from an intelligent man, is there any evidence of a good cop, bad cop strategy here? Is it that thought through?
That is a great question, Callum. I find it hard to see it that way because there aren't really negotiations going on with the Chinese. That in a way they're talking to the diplomatic equivalent of a brick wall right now. And so it doesn't make sense to be, good cop, bad cop until you're in the room with the suspect. That's where that strategy comes from. But at the moment, what's really interesting about China's response to the Trump administration is that they're kind of poker faced. They do fairly limited retaliatory tariffs. They talk tough, as in just the other week, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, if you want a war with China, trade war, or any other kind of war, bring it on. That's effectively what they said. So the Trump administration is sending out all these signals, which I think are contradictory. And the response from the Chinese is, make my day.
Yes. And so is there if we think of Trump and his determination with deal making, the art of the deal, we're seeing it playing out in the context of Ukraine, arguably in the Middle East as well. With that in mind, is it possible to identify whether Trump is whether Trump is considering China from a position of strength or weakness? Who has got the cards, to use his phrase? Who has got the upper hand?
Well, Trump generally has better cards than most of the other countries he deals with. That's why there's an enormous asymmetry in the trade war, because the United States can impose tariffs and inflict more pain on other countries than they can inflict on the United States, because the US is a less open economy. It has a lot of domestic business. It's not that reliant on trade, say, compared with European countries or Asian countries. So that's a general truth. It applies even to China. But if you broaden it out and ask, what about the military dimension? Then it's much less clear that the US has a strong hand. In the Indo-Pacific region, which is the term the US military uses to describe the Pacific theater extending over into the Indian Ocean, the US is a much less strong position than it was even 10 years ago, because the Chinese have invested enormously in military capability in every domain. So they've increased the size of their navy. They've increased the size of their missile defenses. They've increased their space capabilities with a ton of satellites. They've invested who knows how much in drones. So you name it, the Chinese have closed the gap or overtaken the United States. So if it comes to a showdown, it's not clear that Trump has a particularly strong hand. In fact, some would say that the US hand is now distinctly weaker when it comes to the kind of naval showdown that people often talk about.
One of the themes that we've been reflecting since Trump had that, historic phone call, I would argue now, with Vladimir Putin, 6 weeks ago or so, is whether his America First strategy is going to result in America coming last, whether his isolationism is going to result in other countries forming other partnerships and working with other allies before America. And I'm just wondering, in the context of China, actually, if they sense an opportunity there, if there is a sort of looking at America removing itself from being in favour with traditional allies, and whether there's space for China to kind of swoop in. I was looking at an example in Australia, for example, where China's lifted restrictions on Australian exports, wine, red meat, lobster, etc. They've been having high-level talks, and I found that quite fascinating as a consideration.
Yeah, I think the term isolationist has never seemed to me appropriate for Trump.
Yep.
And when people were using it, I would point out that that was probably a category error. We can see that Trump is more of an imperialist than an isolationist in the things he says about Greenland or Canada or, for that matter, the Panama Canal. And that's definitely not an isolationist who wants to expand even American territory in a way that we haven't heard an American president talk about in over a century. But I think you're right to suggest that it could all end with an isolated America. At the heart of Trump's grand strategy, as I understand it, is the belief that somehow Putin can be lured away from the side of Xi Jinping, that you can drive a wedge somehow between Russia and China. That's the only way to interpret the very soft way in which the Russians are being handled by Trump's emissary, Steve Witkoff, who spoke in almost cloying terms about Putin when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. Many Europeans are baffled by this. Why would you be so nice to the war criminal and the aggressor? And the answer is because you're trying to woo him away from China. Ukraine is not the point of this. The point of this is the geopolitics of the great powers. The problem about this argument, which is sometimes called the reverse Nixon strategy, i.e., if Nixon was able to woo the Chinese, then Trump is going to woo the Russians. But either way, you exploit the divisions between them, is that in 1969, Russia, the Soviet Union then, and China were at war. It wasn't like Nixon had to do anything about that. They'd already completely fallen out and hated one another. Today, Putin and Xi seem to be in one of the closest geopolitical relationships in the world, which they consistently, annually, or even more often reaffirm. I can't see why Putin would defect when his entire war effort in Ukraine has been kept afloat by Chinese support in the form of dual-use technology and all kinds of economic relationships. So if you go down the road of being nice to the Russians, making it easy for them in Ukraine, screwing the Europeans, or at least alienating the Europeans with tariffs, telling the Europeans NATO's practically over, you could end up with quite an isolated America if it doesn't work. If the Russians are like, hey, thank you for Ukraine, but we're off to Beijing now, see ya. And you're then left, you've alienated the European allies. They've decided strategic autonomy has to be real. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Japanese and the South Koreans are looking at one another, looking at Trump, looking at China, and wondering where this leaves them. I think you're right to wonder if there's some scenario in which Trump himself ends up isolated.
Yeah. Based on history, Neil, how quickly do these sorts of relationships, changes in approach take effect? Because I feel like with the Trump presidency, perhaps more so this time even than last time, the feeling of whiplash is real as we observe all that is happening. But even in the references you've made in this conversation about Nixon, that's clearly decades ago. And so when we look back through history, how has the US approach to China changed, and how quickly has it changed?
Well, 50 plus years ago, in 1971, Henry Kissinger flew on a secret mission to Beijing, met with Zhou Enlai, and set in motion a great realignment, which brought the United States into a much closer relationship with China than had seemed possible in the 1950s and 1960s. And that was the birth of what I called Chimerica. Over time, with every passing year, China's economy benefited from its relationship to the US, especially after Mao had gone and the reform era began. And so over time, China grew and grew, and its relationship with the US became more and more economically significant. Technology transfer happened, American investment happened, Chinese academics came to the US, studied economics, went back. And before you know it, we're suddenly in 2001, China's being admitted to the World Trade Organization. Fast forward another 15 years, China's economy is practically caught up with the United States, and in some measures it's overtaken it. And enter Trump. That's the great discontinuity, because Trump is the first presidential candidate in a generation to say China's a problem. It's not a solution. It's not good that they're emerging from poverty and becoming an economic superpower. It's a problem, and it's actually deindustrializing America and screwing the middle class and screwing the working class. I think that big change, which happened in 2016 with Trump's election, didn't get interrupted meaningfully by Joe Biden, because the Biden administration took the Trump policy and just continued it. There was no real difference, apart from perhaps that the tech war became more important than the trade war. So here we are. It's 8 years on, and Trump is now in this very critical moment of decision. Does he keep going with what has become Cold War II, where the US is one superpower, China's the other, and that's the main geopolitical story? Or does he kind of flip and say, well, now I've kind of, made my point and shown you that I can be tough. Is it time to be friends now? That seems to me the real moment we've reached. And I think his instinct is to at least do détente, as in some ways he's also doing with Russia. Let's dial it back. He's even talked about cutting the US defense budget, which must have come as a shock to the hawks in the Republican Party. And I think the Chinese are listening carefully and thinking, what do we do? Yeah. Do we go for it? Do we say, sure, we're coming to Beijing or Mar-a-Lago, whatever it is? And I think that's the decision that she has to make. I think Trump has kind of made his move, and the Chinese are pondering whether to do détente with him or force a showdown over Taiwan and take advantage of the fact that Trump does not seem particularly committed to its defense.
So we've mentioned Cold War II. Should we mention the risk of a modern-day Cuban Missile Crisis, as you outline it in Taiwan? And is this another situation where China holds most of the cards? Actually, it's completely reliant on the approach of the Chinese to Taiwan, and therefore what response that could provoke from the US.
This would certainly be a more consequential crisis than the invasion of Ukraine or October 7th, 2023 in the Middle East, because of the massively high economic stakes. I don't know if anybody entirely planned it. In fact, I'm pretty sure nobody did, but we're now in a situation where the most important technological hub on the planet, where the most sophisticated semiconductors get made for NVIDIA, is TSMC, which is located in Taiwan, an island that the Chinese claim belongs to them. And we haven't really denied that claim for 50 years. If Xi Jinping decides to assert that claim and to impose Beijing's authority on the de facto autonomous democracy that Taiwan has become, what does Trump do? The key issue, and the way I try to understand it, is very similar to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, except that the roles are reversed. In 1962, it was an island off the United States that the Soviets began to arm with nuclear weapons. It was the US that blockaded or quarantined Cuba. Then the Soviets had to decide if they were going to run the blockade. If they'd carried on doing that, we might have had World War III. We got very close to it, and then Khrushchev backed down or did a deal with Kennedy. Now the roles are reversed. The island is Taiwan. It's near China. The Chinese have the option of quarantining it. The US isn't stationing nuclear weapons there, but the US has invested a lot in the defense of Taiwan. And of course, it's a much more important economic island than Cuba ever was. GPUs are more important than cigars. So the Taiwan semiconductor crisis is a much bigger economic deal than the Cuban Missile Crisis was, but the stakes are comparably high, because if you miscalculate and Chinese vessels get sunk by say, American drones or American submarines, then you could be in World War III. And that's got to be a concern for both sides. The stakes are supremely high. The thing I can't quite imagine is this edition of Donald Trump, Trump 2.0, the second series, risking World War III over Taiwan. We know that he said to John Bolton in his first term that Taiwan was like a Sharpie, like a pen relative to his desk, the Resolute, which was, he said, more like China. And why would you go to war over a Sharpie? We know that Trump doesn't much mind about whether Taiwan is a democracy or not, any more than he cares about Hong Kong. So the Chinese must be sorely tempted to push the envelope on this issue and see if Trump simply hands over Taiwan without a fight. That would be the best case scenario for Xi Jinping. But the point of my piece is that if Trump says these nice things, or at least these conciliatory things to China, but his administration is full of China hawks, who can really be sure what the Trump administration would do if the Taiwan question got posed? Would they fight or would they fold? Nobody knows.